So we're picking up in today's video with the rise of the nation state. And these began to develop as empires fell. So breaking down this word, the state part of this word just refers to like the actual geographic territory, like the land itself. The nation is based on a common people who share language, ethnicity, the same history. And so these began to develop as the empires began to, fall apart. And the nation states of Europe did a really good job at developing strong central governments. And the purpose of those governments was to raise armies and navies, effectively wage war, keep the peace at home, collect taxes, and this was all done within the confines of the nation state. Theoretically, nation states are supposed to take an interest in the economic welfare of their constituents. That was done differently in each state. Some states adopted mercantilist policies whereby the government controlled imports and exports. Some set up capitalist states where there was free trade, and others had a state-controlled economy. But at any rate, they engaged in some type of external overseas trade, and in this time period, of course, colonization as well. Okay, so we're going to backtrack a little bit and look at the empire of Russia, particularly under Peter the Great. Before Peter the Great, Russia had very little contact with northwestern Europe. That's pretty much what this chapter has been about, the trade networks in Western Europe and the rise of the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English. But Russia really didn't have that benefit because it was geographically remote. Its principal ocean port was ice, solid ice, for most of the year. And so there really wasn't very much foreign trade, and the foreign trade that did exist was carried by foreign ships traveling Russia's rivers. And Russia really didn't begin to take on its modern form until Ivan III, ruling from 1462 to 1505, overthrew the Mongols in 1480. And they set up their capital at Moscow and began to expand from there. And in terms of the economy, Russia only had a really tiny urban trading class and very few big city markets. Most of the people in Europe were serfs. And serfdom is almost like a system of slavery where the serf is a peasant farmer who is bound to the land and legally dependent on his lord. The serfs did have their own homes and livestock and some of their tools and things, but they owed the lord work or labor, dues, and services. And so the majority of Russia was in this position where they were bound to the land of their lord. So when Peter the Great came to the throne, first as a co-emperor in 1682 and then sole emperor in 1696, he saw Sweden as his main enemy, and that was because Sweden held Finland and the entire eastern shore of the Baltic, and so really it was stopping Russia from growing in that direction, and Russia would need some of those Baltic ports in order to expand. So Russia, under Peter the Great, initiated war with Sweden, and Peter was utterly humiliated because 8,000 Swedish troops defeated 40,000 Russians at the Battle of Narva in 1700. And so Peter was humiliated, and he decided that he was going to construct a powerful state in Russia, and it would be based on a strong army and navy. So in order to do that, Peter invited military experts from the West, or from Western Europe, to come to Russia and to lead and to train his troops. And in addition to that, he bought Western European artillery and simply copied it. He also established a navy, and he gave them muskets and uniforms He promoted metallurgy and mining and textile manufacture, anything that would improve the weapons of the Army and Navy. In addition to that, he built a new capital in St. Petersburg. And the point of St. Petersburg was to westernize Europe. Peter was obsessed with Western European culture, and so he wanted to build a city that looked like a Western European city. So fast forwarding a little bit to 1709, Sweden invades Russia again, and this time Peter is prepared. And Peter and his army just keep retreating until the Swedes go deep into Russian inland, and after they become completely exhausted from pursuing him through the severe Russian winter, he then defeated them pretty easily in South Russia at Poltava and defeated what was left of the Swedish army. And so at that point, Sweden sort of fell apart as an imperial force, and Russia began to seize possessions in the Baltic. Peter wanted Russia to be counted among the powerful nations of Europe. And he knew that that would require more than a good military. He knew that that would require it would require cultural and economic ties to the West. And so Peter required Western education for all males. He set up schools in order to do that. He demanded that the wealthy have the tastes and morals of European elites. He forced them to wear European clothing. He made the men shave, or at least trim their beards so that it would be like the Western European style. So he did all these things to try to make Russia more Western and to help establish ties with the West. Economically, Peter fought for the creation of new enterprises. And in order to do that, he had to introduce heavy taxes, which fell really hard on the peasants. But he built a fleet on the Baltic, and he strengthened the economic and political position of the ruling classes, particularly the landowners and the rising urban professional and business classes, but continued to ruthlessly exploit the peasantry. He did not believe in capitalism or free trade. Peter sort of restricted what merchants could do and the types of economic activity that they could carry out. He actually kept the largest enterprises in the hands of the state. So like weapons manufacturing and shipping, he kept pretty much for himself, that the state would be in charge of it. And so with Peter the Great, he was sort of able to bring Russia out of, the Dark Ages and make them more modern. Diverse cultures and trade systems. And we probably should have put that discussion we just had about Russia right here. That would technically go under this category. And I want to say maybe our book even does that. I'm not sure. But we're picking up in this one with the Ottomans and the Mughals. And these were two very powerful empires that were arising in Asia around the same time that Spain and Portugal were becoming large empires in Europe. And there's a lot of connection between these four empires, or not necessarily connection, but similarities. For one, by 1600, all four empires were approaching the height of their reign. By 1700, all four were in severe decline because they had drained the treasury, because of warfare. They didn't have strong state systems, and they didn't really engage in trying to improve things technologically. Also, all four empires allowed control of their economic affairs to fall into the hands of foreigners. And so by the end of our time period that we're talking about, all four empires, Spain, Portugal, the Ottomans, and the Mughals, were they were subordinated to the French and the British, pretty much, on different levels, but in some way they were forced to be subordinated to the French and the British. So the Ottomans did not control their own trade or their own province, initially because they were allied with France, and the French made it so that all goods had to be transported on French ships. But after 1580, the empire's new wealth basically went into the hands of foreign merchants, like we talked about with Spain especially. There was a shift in the balance of trade that also caused the central government to fall very weak. And in order to pay for these new imported manufactured goods that they wanted from Europe, the Ottomans began to export their own raw goods, like agricultural goods, so crops and things. Well, this made the landed aristocracy really wealthy, and they became so wealthy and so powerful that they presented a challenge to the Ottoman government, and they basically wanted to break free, and did break free, from central control. And in India, and we're looking at like 1555 to 1600, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, put his name here, established one of the greatest empires in the world. And one of the changes that he brought to India was a change in trade and the economy there. The markets in India under his reign had a wide variety of shopkeepers, craftsmen, artisans. They had a stable currency, the hundis, that was accepted throughout the empire, that made it easy to exchange money. They had money lenders and money changers who really made those transactions go smoothly. And Indian cities were large and beautiful, and they were financed by wealthy people and powerful guilds. Indian traders were very mobile, so that meant that they were somewhat independent from the government in India. So if the Indian government tried to force changes on them that they did not approve of, they would just leave for another city that was more friendly to their economic pursuits. Indian business was thriving in the coastal areas and like in regards to ocean-going trade, but the imperial government could not really effectively support these trade ventures, mainly because India had no navy. For instance, in 1686, the British blocked Indian trade between Bengal and Southeast Asia, and even took ships belonging to Indian officers and family members of the Mughal emperor. And so the emperor at the time, Aurangzeb, tried to respond to the British by land, and they forced the British out of their settlement at Hooghly. But the British just relocated and built a new town in Calcutta and continued just the same as they always had, their maritime commerce and armed competition. Indian businessmen did a really good job creating good economic institutions, but they did not usually develop impersonal business firms. Most of their firms were like family-owned firms, so they didn't really have like joint stock companies like they did in Europe. And it was the joint stock companies that funded later expeditions and even colonization later on. And so Indian merchants didn't arm themselves like the British did, or they didn't contract armed forces to travel with them as many European merchants did, especially in the joint stock companies. And so they were just sort of there. And the business elites, for the most part, didn't really challenge the power of the emperor. They didn't really try to overthrow the emperor. They were just primarily concerned with economic endeavors. But they never achieved the prominence of empires like the French and the British. So the Ming and Qing dynasties. I realize this video is getting a little bit long, so I'm going to try to speak quickly. The Ming dynasty in China had pretty much closed China off to foreign trade, and they did that so that they could focus on China and protecting the northern borders against the Mongols and the Manchus. And remember, the Mings were the one who repaired the Great Wall and made it 600 miles longer than it was. The Ming limited the size and the power of their navy, and because they did that, they were harassed by pirates, and they responded by just avoiding the sea. So they had a pretty weak response to that. The pirate attacks increased, and the big threat was actually Japan, because at the end of the 16th century, Japan experienced national unification and they brought their pirates under control. But in 1592, they invaded Korea, planning ultimately to invade China. Warfare continued there for years, but Japan finally withdrew in 1598. So at this stage, the Western presence in China was really limited. There were some Portuguese missionaries who were there, but other than that, there weren't many Westerners because international trade had been shut down. Regardless of that, China's economy continued to expand at least until about 1600. In the late Ming period, private seagoing trade finally began to flourish again. And Europeans came, of course, to trade, but the Chinese government tried to restrict them as much as possible to the coast. Nevertheless, about 1/3 to 1/2 of all silver in the New World ultimately ended up in China because the Europeans were buying silk, porcelain, and tea. Unfortunately, despite that new wealth, the Ming administration continued to weaken. And when the Dutch and the British arrived in the 1600s, they just declined from there. So the Qing dynasty, this is actually the Manchus, or the Manchurians from the north of the Great Wall. They captured the government of China in 1644 and made it all the way to the southern coast of China, taking that over by 1683. And they established the Canton system, which really restricted European traders to just one area, and that was Canton. So because of those restrictions and because of the size of China, European merchants had a very small effect on China. Okay, so Tokugawa, Japan. Early on, Europeans came into Japan and were welcomed. Roman Catholicism appeared in 1549, carried there by Jesuit priest Francis Xavier. And for the most part, Europeans, including Christians, were warmly welcomed at first. The Japanese shogun, and this is like the leader of their government, he's really like a military commander. The shogun, this is a title, not a person's name, at the time, Oda Nobunaga, encouraged the Jesuits in their missionary work. And so because of that, Christianity found a foothold in Japan. This began to change around 1600, this began to change. And after the Spanish had colonized Manila, they became a little bit obnoxious in their power. And so the shogun at the time responded to this by crucifying 6 Franciscan missionaries and 18 Japanese converts. So in 1606, Christianity was outlawed, and in 1614, the shogun began to expel all Christian missionaries. But like China, the suppression of Western contact didn't really cripple Japan. Their process of political consolidation continued, their economy thrived, agriculture prospered, and they grew all kinds of crops like indigo, tobacco, sugarcane, also food crops, of course. Their population almost doubled from 1600 to 1750. And the city merchants called Konin or Shonen, I'm not sure, but they emerged as this new, powerful, wealthy merchant class. And they supplied the banking, the shipping, the loans, any type of commercial or business type service. And they founded family businesses. And many of these family businesses are actually still in operation today. And proof of this was the growth of their capital at Edo, which is Tokyo, which grew to 1 million people by 1700. And it was one of the largest cities in the world. So this is kind of a reverse of the European pattern, in that Japan was still doing well despite cutting off almost all international trade. So lastly, Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia was one of the great prizes of international commercial competition. Foreign merchants who had come from India and Arabia, Europe, China, and Japan were active in the Southeast Asian markets. But the indigenous merchants, or the people who lived in Southeast Asia, didn't really become major traders in the international side of trade. They traded locally, but they really didn't trade on an international scale. So foreign merchants were able to come in, and they started on the coast, but eventually they moved inland, taking control of local Southeast Asian markets. The Dutch, for example, in 1640, under the Dutch East India Company, expelled from the Indonesian archipelago the local merchants and European competitors. And by this time, the spice trade was beginning to die off, so they restructured their trade to produce commercial crops like sugar, coffee, and tobacco. And the Spanish did a similar thing in the Philippines. But the point here is that capitalist enterprise in the hands of these merchants, who were backed by their state governments and their state military, just radiated out of Europe. And Southeast Asia became a participant and a victim of this new system of trade.